October 17, 2019. 2:30 in the afternoon. The streets of Culiacan, Sinaloa are bustling with normal life. Children walk home from school. Vendors sell fresh fruit on street corners. Office workers grab lunch at local taquerias. Nobody knows that in the next 4 hours, their city will become the stage for something that has never happened before in modern history. 3 blocks away from the busy Plaza de Armas, 35 Mexican National Guard members are surrounding a modest White House in the Tres Rios neighborhood. The address, Emiliano Zapata Street. The target, a 29-year-old man who most of the world has never heard of, but whose bloodline carries more power than some presidents. His name is Ovidio Guzmán López. And he's about to turn the Mexican government's greatest victory into their most humiliating defeat. But here's what makes this story impossible to believe. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. Every detail has been verified by multiple government sources, documented in military reports, and captured on hundreds of cell phone videos that went viral around the world in real time. In the next 8 minutes, I'm going to tell you exactly how one phone call from a drug dealer's son brought the 6th largest military in North America to its knees. How 700 gunmen materialized out of nowhere in a coordinated assault that looked more like D-Day than a street fight. And how the President of Mexico was forced to make a decision that shocked every intelligence agency on the planet. You see, Ovidio wasn't just any criminal. He was the heir to an empire built by his father, Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán, the most notorious drug lord in history. When El Chapo was captured and extradited to the United States in 2017, he didn't just leave behind tunnels and drug routes. He left behind 4 sons, each controlling different pieces of the Sinaloa Cartel, each with their own armies, and each with a very simple understanding: surrender means death. But Ovidio had something his brothers didn't. He had turned Culiacan into his personal fortress. Not with walls or gates, but with something far more powerful: loyalty bought with blood, money, and the promise that the Sinaloa Cartel protected its own better than the government ever could. The Mexican authorities thought they were arresting a drug dealer. They had no idea they were about to declare war on an entire city. At exactly 2:47 p.m., 17 minutes after Ovidio was handcuffed inside that White House, the first gunshots echoed across Culiacan. But these weren't random shots fired by panicked criminals. These were coordinated signals, the opening notes of a symphony of violence that had been rehearsed for months. Within minutes, roadblocks appeared on every major highway leading out of the city. Burning vehicles blocked intersections. Men with military-grade weapons took positions on rooftops. And something started happening that intelligence agencies are still studying today: ordinary civilians began helping the gunmen. Because in Culiacan, the line between criminal and citizen had disappeared years ago. The cartel wasn't just an organization, it was the economy, the employer, the protector, and for many families, the only reason they could put food on the table. What the government discovered that day was terrifying: they weren't fighting a drug cartel. They were fighting a shadow government that had more loyalty, more resources, and more intelligence than the real one. By 3:15 p.m., videos started appearing on social media that looked like scenes from a war zone. Armed enforcers with .50 caliber rifles and rocket-propelled grenades were moving through the streets in convoy formation. But this wasn't chaos, this was precision. Every move had been planned. Every target had been selected. Every escape route had been mapped. The cartel had turned urban warfare into an art form, and they were about to give the Mexican military a masterclass in asymmetric combat. But the most chilling part wasn't the weapons or the coordination. It was the intelligence network. Around 700 cartel gunmen seemed to know exactly where every government vehicle was located at every moment. They knew which routes the military would use to retreat. They knew the names and addresses of soldiers' families. They had turned an entire city into their eyes and ears. And at 4:30 p.m., they used that intelligence to deliver an ultimatum that would change everything. The call came directly to President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. On the other end was his defense secretary, and the message was as clear as it was unthinkable: "Mr. President, we cannot hold the city. They have us surrounded. They have hostages. And they're broadcasting our defeat live on social media. Think about those words for a moment. The Mexican military, 240,000 active personnel, billions of dollars in equipment, backed by the full authority of the federal government, was asking permission to surrender to a criminal organization. What happened next broke every rule of modern governance. At 5:47 p.m., President López Obrador made a decision that intelligence agencies around the world are still analyzing. He ordered the release of Ovidio Guzmán López. The official statement claimed it was to prevent further loss of life. But everyone watching knew the truth. The government had ceded battle to the cartel, and they had done it on live television for the entire world to see. But this isn't where our story ends. Because what happened in the hours after Ovidio's release revealed something even more disturbing about who really controls Mexico. The speed with which violence stopped, the precision with which the city returned to normal, and the message it sent to every criminal organization watching around the world. October 17, 2019 wasn't just the day the Sinaloa Cartel defeated the Mexican government. It was the day they proved that in some parts of the world, criminal organizations have become more powerful than the states that are supposed to control them. And the lessons learned from those 4 hours in Culiacan are being applied by cartels and criminal groups across the globe right now, as you're watching this video. What I'm about to show you next is how this impossible victory was planned, executed, and why the consequences are still reshaping the balance of power between governments and organized crime across Latin America. The Siege of Culiacan lasted exactly 4 hours and 7 minutes. But to understand how 700 gunmen could defeat an entire government in less time than it takes to watch a movie, we need to go back to where it all started.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
To understand how one arrest could bring an entire nation to its knees, you need to understand the man they came for. Ovidio Guzmán López wasn't just another drug dealer with a famous last name. He was the heir to a criminal dynasty that had rewritten the rules of power in Mexico. His father, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, didn't just run a drug cartel. He built something that had never existed before in the history of organized crime, a multinational corporation that happened to be illegal. For nearly 3 decades, El Chapo's Sinaloa organization moved more cocaine across international borders than some countries move legitimate exports. But here's what made El Chapo different from every other drug lord before him. He understood that true power didn't come from violence alone. It came from becoming indispensable. El Chapo pioneered the use of sophisticated tunnels to move drugs across the border into the United States. But these weren't crude holes in the ground. They were engineering marvels with concrete walls, railway systems, ventilation, and electric lighting. Some stretched for miles underground, connecting warehouses in Mexico to distribution centers in California with precision that would make subway engineers jealous. The tunnel systems were so complex they connected as many as 7 safe houses, with steel doors that could withstand military assault. When authorities tried to raid one location, El Chapo would simply disappear through his underground highways like a ghost. By the early 2000s, El Chapo was considered the most powerful drug lord in the world, inspiring folk songs and appearing on Forbes' list of most powerful people for several years from 2009 to 2013. Think about that for a moment. A criminal was so influential that legitimate business magazines ranked him alongside presidents and CEOs. But power like that doesn't just disappear when one man gets arrested. It gets inherited. In 1977, El Chapo married Alejandrina Maria Salazar Hernandez in a small ceremony in the town of Jesus Maria, Sinaloa. The couple had 4 children: Cesar, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, and Alejandrina Giselle. But El Chapo had more than one family, and more than 4 sons who would carry his blood. The 4 sons who would become known as Los Chapitos were Joaquín Guzmán López, Ovidio Guzmán López, Iván Archivaldo Guzmán Salazar, and Jesus Alfredo Guzmán Salazar. Each was raised understanding that they weren't just children of a famous father. They were princes in a kingdom built on cocaine and corruption. When El Chapo was finally captured and extradited to the United States in 2017, he didn't just leave behind drug routes and money. He left behind a power vacuum that his sons were determined to fill. But they also inherited something else: enemies. Every rival cartel, every ambitious lieutenant, every government agency that had been held back by fear of El Chapo's retaliation suddenly saw opportunity. The Sinaloa Cartel wasn't just fighting for market share anymore. They were fighting for survival. But Ovidio had something his brothers didn't have. While Ivan Archivaldo and Jesus Alfredo controlled trafficking routes and money laundering operations, Ovidio controlled Culiacan itself. And Culiacan wasn't just a city. It was the beating heart of the Sinaloa Cartel's power. After his father's arrest, Ovidio took on a prominent role in the Sinaloa Cartel, leading the organization along with his brothers and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. But what made Ovidio different was how he understood power in the modern age. Where his father had ruled through fear and respect, Ovidio ruled through economics and loyalty. He understood that in a city where government jobs paid $200 a month, a cartel position that paid $2,000 bought more than just an employee. It bought a family's devotion. The Sinaloa Cartel became Culiacan's largest employer. They built schools, paved roads, and provided medical care that the government couldn't afford. They settled disputes that police wouldn't handle. They protected neighborhoods that authorities had abandoned. But this wasn't charity. This was strategy. Every family that depended on cartel money for survival became part of their intelligence network. Every small business that laundered drug profits became invested in the organization's success. Every child who grew up seeing cartel members as protectors and providers became a potential recruit. By 2019, the line between the Sinaloa Cartel and the city of Culiacan had completely disappeared. They weren't just operating in the community. They had become the community. Following El Chapo's 2019 conviction in the United States, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo Guzmán Salazar, and half-brother Ovidio Guzmán López increased their power within the Sinaloa Cartel. But Ovidio understood something his father never fully grasped. In the age of social media and instant communication, public perception was as important as private power. While other cartel leaders stayed in the shadows, Ovidio cultivated an image. He was young, charismatic, and careful to be seen as a protector rather than a predator. When floods hit Culiacan, his people were the first to deliver aid. When businesses struggled, cartel money kept them afloat. When families faced threats, Ovidio's enforcers provided security. This wasn't just about drugs anymore. This was about governance. The Sinaloa Cartel under Los Chapitos had evolved into something law enforcement agencies around the world were struggling to understand: a parallel government that provided services, maintained order, and commanded loyalty through competence rather than just fear. And on October 17, 2019, the Mexican government was about to discover just how complete that transformation had become. Because when they came for Ovidio, they weren't just arresting a drug dealer. They were attempting to overthrow the shadow government of Culiacan. What happened next would prove that sometimes, the most dangerous inheritance isn't money or property. It's loyalty. And Ovidio Guzmán López had inherited the loyalty of an entire city. The question was, how far would that city go to protect him? The answer would shock the world and rewrite every textbook on modern warfare between states and criminal organizations. Because in the next few hours, 700 gunmen were going to demonstrate that they weren't just defending a drug dealer. They were defending their way of life, their economy, and their understanding of who really held power in Mexico. And they were willing to go to war with their own government to prove it. But to understand how Ovidio built such complete control over Culiacan, we need to examine the intelligence operation that led authorities to his door. Because what the Mexican government discovered about his organization would terrify them long before the first shot was fired. For 6 months before October 17, 2019, a shadow war was being fought in the digital realm. Mexican and American intelligence agencies were tracking Ovidio Guzmán through a sophisticated web of intercepted phone calls, satellite surveillance, and human intelligence that stretched from Culiacan to Chicago. But what they didn't know was that they were being hunted in return. The Sinaloa Cartel had developed something law enforcement agencies were completely unprepared for, a counterintelligence operation that rivaled government capabilities. In 2018, investigators later discovered, the Sinaloa Cartel had hired a professional hacker who successfully infiltrated Mexico City's surveillance camera system and gained access to FBI phone records. This wasn't some amateur operation run from a basement. This was corporate-level espionage that allowed the cartel to track federal agents in real time. The implications were terrifying. Every time American or Mexican agents moved to gather intelligence on cartel operations, the cartel knew they were coming. Every informant who agreed to cooperate was identified and eliminated. Every safe house was compromised before it could be used. But in the summer of 2019, intelligence agencies thought they had found their breakthrough. Ovidio had made a critical mistake that would eventually lead them to his door. According to former U.S. Attorney General William Barr, the Drug Enforcement Administration was behind the operation that led to the October 17 arrest attempt. The DEA had been tracking Ovidio's communications for months, building a pattern of his movements and identifying his safe houses in Culiacan. What they discovered was both impressive and terrifying. Ovidio wasn't just running a drug operation. He was running a parallel intelligence service that had infiltrated Mexican law enforcement at every level. Phone records showed regular communications with police commanders, military officers, and government officials who were feeding information directly to the cartel. The intercepted conversations revealed something that chilled investigators to the bone. In one recorded call from August 2019, Ovidio could be heard giving explicit instructions to his security team: "If they come for me, make sure they understand the price. The whole city pays if I'm taken." But the most disturbing intelligence came from studying the cartel's organizational structure. Unlike traditional criminal organizations, the Sinaloa Cartel under Ovidio's leadership had developed something that looked more like a government than a gang. They had separate divisions for intelligence gathering, communications, logistics, security, and what could only be described as community relations. Each division reported through a chain of command that would make military officers envious. And at the center of it all was Ovidio, coordinating operations with the precision of a head of state. Intelligence agencies also discovered that the cartel had created their own communications network that bypassed traditional phone and internet systems. They used encrypted radios, coded WhatsApp groups, and even their own private internet infrastructure that made government surveillance almost impossible. But what truly shocked investigators was the level of training cartel members received. Intercepted videos showed training camps where recruits learned not just how to use weapons, but how to conduct surveillance, gather intelligence, and coordinate military-style operations. By September 2019, intelligence agencies realized they weren't just dealing with a drug trafficking organization. They were facing a shadow government that had better intelligence capabilities than many legitimate governments. And that shadow government was about to demonstrate exactly why they had invested so heavily in information warfare. Because on October 17, when Mexican forces moved to arrest Ovidio, they would discover that every detail of their operation had been known by the cartel for weeks. The question wasn't whether they could capture Ovidio. The question was whether they could survive what happened next. Because the Sinaloa Cartel had spent months preparing for this exact moment, and they had turned the entire city of Culiacan into a weapon pointed directly at the heart of the Mexican government. At 2:30 p.m., October 17, 2019. In the quieter-looking Tres Rios neighborhood of Culiacan, only 30 National Guard and military operatives surround a seemingly ordinary house. Their mission: find Ovidio. Capture him. Hurry out. But beneath that calm lies a storm about to erupt. Within minutes, the perimeter tightens. The entry team breaches the door, a swift, surgical movement. Inside, chaos restrained, Ovidio Guzmán López is handcuffed. For 12 precious minutes, it looks like a success. Then everything explodes. At 2:47 p.m., a crack of gunfire shatters the facade. By 2:52 p.m., streets erupt with roadblocks, burning cars, shouting men. At 3 p.m., Culiacan lies cut off from the world. This isn't random chaos, it's a battle plan executed to perfection. Cartel gunmen, staggering numbers, 700 to 800, pour into the city. They carry heavy machine guns, RPGs, improvised armored vehicles. It's not just firepower, it's theater, and they were prepared. And then the twist, the authorities didn't expect this, civilians join the siege. Families delivering water to checkpoints, children scavenging to reload weapons. The line between cartel and citizen has vanished. Chaos spreads fast. A prison riot, 50 inmates escape, flood the streets. Military families targeted. Hostage threats mount. Ships of war disguised in beat-up trucks now roll. Federal reinforcements try to push through, but sniper fire rains down. A team is pinned. Vehicles are disabled. Full-scale urban warfare ignites. Toll mounts, official reports cite around 14 dead, including soldiers, cartel members, and civilians. Dozens wounded. Military hardware, damaged beyond repair. The operation unravels in real time. At 4:25 p.m., Guzmán speaks into a phone. His words, "Calm, stop this. I've surrendered." But his brother responds with a defiant refusal. The city pulses with violence. The power dynamics have already shifted. By early evening, heavy decisions unfold. The president, briefed at 4:45 p.m., confronts a nightmare. Can he withdraw? The order comes to back down, to release. At the 6-hour mark, Ovidio is free. The raid ends, not with triumph, but retreat. Even as the dust settles, Culiacan is forever changed. The city that once stood behind its walls now trembles at the power of its own shadows. What they unleashed wasn't just a failed arrest, it was a demonstration of who truly commands the streets. And what comes next is far darker. By 3:15 p.m., Culiacan had transformed into a living war zone. This was no clash between black and white morality. This was something raw. Something terrifying. Here, civilians did the unthinkable, handing ammo to gunmen, helping reload weapons in the middle of shootouts, delivering water and food to armed checkpoints, often through tears, with trembling hands. Children as young as 12 carried magazines, as though it's a rite of passage in hell. A schoolteacher, Maria Gonzalez, who sheltered nearby, described it best: it wasn't that people supported the violence. It was that they knew who really controlled the city. And it wasn't the government. Cartel strategy had evolved into living propaganda, burning vehicles to seal off roads, turning apartment buildings into sniper nests, and orchestrating attacks via encrypted WhatsApp groups with thousands of members. But the most terrifying weapon wasn't the arsenal. It was intelligence. The cartel had mapped out government operations, every military vehicle's location, every soldier's home address, every predictable escape route. They turned every resident, every street corner, into an information network, an enemy inside the walls. As helicopters churned the sky, and gunfire echoed in the urban canyons, control shifted. The state was no longer the authority here. And that's when President López Obrador faced a decision that would not only define his presidency, but expose the real power ruling Culiacan. 4:30 p.m., the clock ticks. Inside the presidential palace, the phone rings, piercing the heavy silence of a decision with irreversible ramifications. Defense Secretary Luis Crescencio Sandoval's voice cracks through the line, "Mr. President, we can't hold the city." In that instant, the chilling truth lands: Mexico's well-equipped military, 240,000 strong, is outmatched. Down in Culiacan, the shock of the message ricochets as citizens hide in homes, cars, basements, soundtracked by relentless gunfire and low-flying helicopters. At 5 p.m., the social media frenzy begins. Dozens of live streams go viral: smoldering armored vehicles, soldiers dropping rifles, cartel members waving triumphantly from atop barricades. The world watches Mexico falter. 5:30 p.m., international headlines flash wild. Analysts compare this moment to watching a fallen empire unravel in real time, a government on its knees before terror. Then, 5:47 p.m. The order comes through. The president's voice cracks, "Release him." A single phrase, shaking the foundations of stated authority. Immediately, officials script a narrative, "We did it to save lives." The message is rehearsed, but the optics are raw, surrender by any other name. Across Culiacan, there's no unified celebration. Some cheer in relief. Others whisper, now they know who's in charge. A professor later reflects. People said at least they spare us a massacre. Revealing a tragic acceptance. Meanwhile, security experts issue urgent warnings. This capitulation emboldens criminal organizations globally. It sends a message that violence trumps law. At 7 p.m., the president returns to his desk, weary. The cost, not just the loss of a detainee, but the very illusion of a state in control. Within minutes of surrender, Culiacan is still. Not a gradual shift, just the sudden hush of a battlefield emptied, as if an invisible hand pressed pause on chaos. Then, as dusk settles, something extraordinary, every roadblock lifts. Armed men disappear into unmarked vans. Gunfire fades. A city that was a war zone returns to an almost normal rhythm, street vendors re-emerge, traffic resumes, shops flick back to life. Why? Because someone signaled, clearly and powerfully, that they control the city now. Not the federal government. The Sinaloa Cartel. In the ensuing weeks, the truth unraveled layer by layer. Reports confirmed cartel infiltration into nearly every institution, local police answering to cartel controllers, military officers receiving payments, judges ruling in cartel-friendly decisions, politicians on the payroll. One shocking intercepted communication captured it all, a leader's voice, cold and confident. "We don't fight the government. We make them irrelevant." Because they achieved that, the government became irrelevant in Culiacan. Cartel courts ran quietly in alleys. Taxation happened at street level. Infrastructure, schools, clinics, markets, relied on cartel funds or protection. The line between criminal and civic blurred. Ordinary residents found themselves needing cartel permission to get daily necessities, clearance to travel, to open businesses, even to send kids to school. Meanwhile, attempts to restore government control faltered. Federal patrols drove through, but met cautious silence. People now feared retaliation from cartel informants more than the crime they'd once rebelled against. Beyond Culiacan's borders, the effects rippled out. The cartel's success emboldened cells across Mexico. Internal violence among factions surged, hundreds killed, thousands disappeared, over 500 dead, 600 missing in internal Sinaloa fighting alone. Meanwhile, in U.S. courts, Ismael El Mayo Zambada pleaded guilty to charges including leading a criminal enterprise, and crucially admitted decades of corruption, bribing police, judges, military, even governors. His plea shone a harsh light on cartel-state symbiosis. The Sinaloa Cartel hadn't only seized a city, they'd co-opted institutions. Today, Culiacan stands at an uneasy crossroads. Occasional raids uncover weapons caches and cartel paraphernalia, but those are traces, not change. One recent operation seized 37 firearms, heavy drugs, and tactical gear, and yet no arrests were made, underscoring a haunting truth: enforcement exists only when it's safe, not when it matters. The story of October 17, 2019, was not the end. It was a lesson. And now, the man they released, Ovidio Guzmán López, is more than free. He's become the symbol of what happens when fear rules, and captivity may actually be safer than freed. January 5, 2023. 3 years and 3 months after the Siege of Culiacán. This time, the Mexican government wasn't going to take any chances. At dawn, 3,000 soldiers, backed by Black Hawk helicopters and armored convoys, descended on Jesus Maria, a small town just outside Culiacan. Their target, the same man who had once forced the nation to its knees. Ovidio Guzmán López. Within hours, the city was once again on fire. Roadblocks, burning buses, armored gunmen flooding the streets, it felt like déjà vu. Still, 29 people died. Soldiers, cartel gunmen, and civilians caught in the crossfire. The battle left entire neighborhoods resembling war zones. Because in the 3 years between Ovidio's captures, investigators uncovered something far more disturbing than the battle itself. The Siege of Culiacan had not been a desperate defense. It had been a message. After Culiacan, cartel strategy across Mexico began to change. They no longer saw themselves as fugitives hiding from the government. They saw themselves as armies. But the consequences were not only military. They were psychological. Parents told their children, "Stay inside. Don't trust the soldiers. The cartel decides what happens here." Maria Gonzalez, the schoolteacher, reflecting years later, "The day they released Ovidio, something broke inside us. We realized who really gave the orders in our city." Here is the truth investigators finally admitted behind closed doors: the Siege of Culiacan wasn't just a battle. It was a recruitment video. The Siege of Culiacan lasted 4 hours. Its consequences will last generations. On October 17, 2019, the Sinaloa Cartel won both. If this story opened your eyes to how power really works in the modern world, hit that subscribe button. Because these are the stories that mainstream media won't tell you. Stories buried in government files, whispered about in cartel corridors, and hidden in plain sight. Subscribe now. Because if you thought the Siege of Culiacan was terrifying, what you're about to hear next will change everything you thought you knew.